Thank you. So many of us think of pollinators primarily as being bees, but there are many other organisms, animals that serve as pollinators to many of the trees and shrubs and beautiful flowers we have, but also our foods. So some of those include birds like hummingbirds in particular, butterflies, even beetles, flies, and other insects. We don't have any pollinator bats in Michigan, but if anybody likes products from agave, bats in southwestern United States are used in pollinating of agave. So here's a little look at just how many different caterpillars there are for all the different Lepidoptera, so that means the butterflies and moths, that you might be able to find on some of your native plants. One in particular, if you vegetable garden, that you might see on your native plants is the black swallowtail. The black swallowtail's host plant, the native plant is Zizia aurea or golden Alexander, but you often find the caterpillars if you're growing carrots, parsley, dill, or fennel. But please leave some extra plants for them to eat because they will turn into this beautiful black swallowtail butterfly that you see on the right there. But they overwinter as a chrysalis, and the chrysalis is, you'll see on the upper right here, and it looks just like a little bit of a twig. They camouflage very well to try to not be eaten by the birds over the winter. We started off the presentation talking about the monarch, so we'll talk a little bit more on the monarch. So the monarch's host plant, the only plant that it does eat is a milkweed. We actually have about a dozen different native milkweeds in Michigan. Most people are only familiar with the common milkweed, but there's some other beautiful ones, like the one you see here on the left, the swamp milkweed or rose milkweed. The orange one is a butterfly milkweed, and then the one on the right is the more common one that you see, the common milkweed. Only the common milkweed is really aggressive in yards. The other types of milkweeds are actually pretty well behaved and will stay in one place as a clump. So they are really great to look for to put into your yard. So if we didn't have milkweeds along the pathway for the monarchs, they have multiple generations coming up to Michigan and then going back down to Mexico. So they need milkweeds all along the way to feed the larvae, the caterpillars, that they can then turn into adult butterflies and fly the next distance. We do have a handout in our gardening guide that will list the host plants for the many different Michigan butterflies. Most butterflies actually are very specific to the types of plants that they can eat. So while monarchs are specific on milkweed, many other butterflies can't eat milkweed, just like we had seen with the black swallowtail, that's eating the carrot family Umbelliferae. But there's lots of swallowtails that are in that same family that don't eat the Umbelliferae. There's the tiger swallowtail actually eats trees primarily. The spicebush swallowtail eats a spicebush that's a native shrub. And then there's a pipevine swallowtail that eats pipevine plants. So even within a family of butterflies, such as the swallowtail family, there's different host plants for them. And so if you don't have their host plant, you won't see many of the adult butterflies around. So a little bit more in detail on the life cycle of the monarch butterfly. So you have the adult who lays an egg, a little teeny tiny egg. And it just looks like a little seed or spot on the edge of a leaf, maybe even just a little drop of sap. It's so tiny to see. So that's number one at the top. A few days after it's laid, the caterpillar hatches and starts to eat some of the leaf of the milkweed. It goes through 5 different instars before it can pupate. So here it's gone through multiple instars, getting slightly bigger and sometimes slightly different coloring on it. Then it'll go into this shape called a J form, and then that means it's about to go into its chrysalis. So number 3 is we're actually seeing it into this beautiful green chrysalis, and it has little gold markings on it. It's amazing that they have a decoration that it actually is sparkly gold. So it almost looks like fairies came and painted on their chrysalis. After about 2 weeks, the green cocoon will then start turning the colors of, it actually gets clear, so you're seeing the internal butterfly. So the day that you see the chrysalis darken into the orange and black of the butterfly is about when it's going to eat clothes. And then you'll get another beautiful big monarch, like the one we're seeing in the middle. And the cycle will repeat once again. In Michigan, we have about 3 generations of monarch butterflies. You'll usually see the first ones coming into Michigan around May, and then you'll see additional populations throughout the summer, usually the highest populations being around in August, September, and then they'll fill up their last fill and start flying down to Mexico for the rest of the year. So they overwinter in Mexico and then have to fly all the way back again. So here we can see their migration route. They actually have 2 different populations of monarchs. So we have the eastern monarch that's doing east of the Rocky Mountains, and then there's a western monarch population. And the western monarch population, they were really concerned that it might actually die out. And they were trying to get it put on the endangered species list. They've seen a nice resurgence in butterflies this year, but it's still not out of the woods. You can get some of the butterflies moving back and forth across the Rockies, but for the most part, the populations stay separate. But geez, that's a real far distance to travel, isn't it? So here, while the monarch butterflies migrate south in the winter, most of our butterflies that are native to Michigan do not. In fact, they overwinter right here in your yards and in our natural areas. We have over 110 native butterflies, 49 skippers, and over 1,000 moths in Michigan. Here's one of the most beautiful of the moths. It's called a giant silk moth. This one's a Cecropia moth, and it's about the size of my hand. It's that large. They're a beautiful, they only live as adults for a few weeks in order to mate. They don't actually even have mouth parts to eat. They spend most of their time throughout the summer as a caterpillar, as you see on the lower left. They change multiple colors and get bigger and bigger until they begin to form a cocoon. In sort of mid to late summer, once they've had their fill of eating the leaves of trees typically, they find a place and they start grabbing little leaves together. And inside of here is actually, they've spun their silk to make a cocoon that will protect them over the winter. So most people would never even realize that there was actually a moth cocoon in the middle of these leaves. And then just as talking about the swallowtail, again, the swallowtail tries to camouflage itself over the winter. And so this one's one of my spicebush caterpillars, and you probably can't see it from a distance. If you get up really close, it's actually this little guy right here, and he just looks like a leaf because he's colored exactly the same as the leaves. And he'll just hang on all winter long until it gets warm enough for him to come out of his chrysalis. But he's just trying to camouflage, over the winter. So that's why it's really important, when you're cutting your shrubs or trees or raking up your leaves, that, you might have these little guys that you were trying to attract to your yard hidden among them. So here's another look at more of our butterflies that hang out in all winter, and they can hang out in any form. So some of them, like the question mark or the comma, can actually be an adult butterfly over the winter. Some of them are in the chrysalis, like I showed. Some of them could just be in an egg form, and other ones actually overwinter as a larva or a pupae down in the ground. So a little bit more about the pollinators that we think of most when we mention pollinators, which is our bees. Most people only can think about and name the honeybee. The honeybee is actually a European species and not native to America. However, we have here in Michigan over 465 native bees to Michigan. But most of them live solitary lives, and so you don't really see them very much because they're not in large numbers. However, we're seeing just like the monarch, we're seeing significant declines in our bee populations. In fact, 50% of them are in severe decline. 1 in 4 are imperiled here in Michigan. So bees are very adapted to the plants that they're getting nectar and pollen from. Bees you could consider as being vegetarian because they feed their babies pollen from flowers. So The flowers have lots of different shapes, and so bees have different shapes to their mouth parts, their bee beaks or their tongues. And so some of them have very long tongues and can reach down into tubular flowers, and other ones have very short tongues and need flowers that have nectar and pollen readily available with very short tongues like the Asteraceae family. And about 25% of our native bees are pollen specific, so they can only get pollen from one particular genus or a few plants to feed to their babies. Just like human babies need specific food, you can't just eat everything. While many bees and other pollinators can eat nectar from any plant, it's the pollen that's really important. So if you don't have the right pollen plant, you can't feed the babies of those bees to make more bees. So how do we protect more of these bees? First, recognize that 90% of them are solitary, so they will not sting you. They don't have a nest to defend like a honeybee would. So don't be afraid of them. And also, out of that 90% being solitary, about 70% of them nest actually in the ground, so having undisturbed ground is really important. And only about 30% of them nest in cavities above ground. Bumblebees bumblebees are semi-social and will make small colonies, but they're usually only about 100 individuals in the colony versus honeybees. When you have the big hives, you can have up to 50,000 honeybees in a hive. But our native bees, we're talking, if a solitary bee is laying its eggs, they're usually laying about a dozen, not many. So again, they don't have large numbers of cast in their groupings to say you're going to be a soldier and protect the nest. That it pretty much, the males hatch, mate with the females go out and spend all of her time foraging and creating her little cocoons. So in here you'll see a pithy stem where she's burrowed a hole into the edge of a raspberry cane to make and protect her babies over the winter. And generally they'll spend the whole winter as a pupae stage in that stem, and then hatch in the next spring or the next summer whenever their plant is in flower for them to be. Sometimes you'll see perfect little circles in some of your plants, particularly rose plants tend to be a popular one, but that other leafy image where you see those perfect little circles, those are actually from leafcutter bees in the Megalochylidae family, and they can also cut up petals or flower, typically it's leaves, but they make little capsules out of the leaves to protect their babies. So when you see those holes, it's usually not doing any real damage to the plant, doesn't harm the plant, but recognize that that's going to be to help make a little house for a baby bee. So please don't disturb those, and don't try to treat your plants if you see them having these holes in them. Know that you're actually helping the native bees. So other things that we can do, we're encouraging people to leave stems up of their plants over the winter because the seeds will feed the birds. So, but then once spring comes, even if all the seeds have been eaten off, if you have stems that are still standing, that means they're probably strong enough that they can be used by the bees to make their cavities like in that raspberry cane. So we're asking people to trim those plants only to knee height. Leave some stem stubble so that the new bees can have new homes. And then, very quickly, a lot of plants will have new growth covering up that stubble, so you won't even see it anyways by the time the end of May or June comes. It'll all be covered up by the new growth. So here, and again, we'll have it as part of our gardening guide, but here's a list of plants that are typically being used by those cavity stem nesting bees. And this is the type of level cleanup that we're talking about doing. So on the left, we've left everything over the winter to feed the birds. And here on the right, we've done some slight cleanup, just trimming up a little bit of the grass top. And again, trimming those pithy stems to about knee height. So you can do some tidying, but think about leaving some of it for the homes for the baby bees and other butterflies. So it's really important, after we've been trying to attract all these pollinators, as I've been showing, they're in the leaves. We don't want to take that to the curb. So the leaves actually contain a lot of nutrients to them that can feed back into the lawn and the trees and the perennials that we put in. They also are the warm blanket that is protecting the caterpillars that have gone down into the ground and help keep a thermal layer over that grass. So we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot if we rake up all of the leaves and maybe rake up all the stuff that we just attracted to the yard for the fall and then throwing it out to the curb. It'll be hard for that organism to hatch and then come back to your yard again, right? You want to let it stay there over the winter and again through the spring and let it hatch right in your yard. So think about not throwing away those leaves. And it doesn't have to be messy. You don't have to leave every leaf exactly where it laid. You can rake them up into piles. In particular, it's really good to put them underneath the trees. If you do have far too many leaves, it's okay. I prefer that you actually mulch mow them into the grass, because then you're returning at least the nutrients back into the grass areas and to the trees. Try to use them as mulch around your plants. It's always seemed a little silly to me that here we have dried material that we're putting around plants that we came for free from our trees, mostly, right? And we're going to rake it and send it away. And now we got to go to the store and buy trees that have been chopped up and put it back down. So just think about the leaves as being your mulch. And then grow ground covers up through those leaves, and then you really don't need any wood mulch at all. All right, so I hope I've convinced all of you that pollinator gardens are actually alive all year round, and it's not just in the summertime when the flowers are blooming. Next, we'll talk a little bit about planting, and I'll return the mic back to Marilyn.
Thanks. Well, thank you, Valerie. I always learn more each time. Thank you for watching part 2 of our 3-part series on how to save their pollinators. I hope you found it informative. And if you'd like to learn more, buzz on over to rochesterpollinators.org.